don't think it's right to make those comparisons. It's completely different. And the Prime Minister said yesterday, I think almost in the same breath, talked about the diverse country that we are and that being part of our strength.
I'm not saying it is Enoch Powell. I'm saying, did he know? Did his speechwriters know? Did you know that he was echoing Enoch Powell? And are you uncomfortable with it?
You know, everybody always gets caught up in focusing on different phrases.
Hash behind the scenes. Yvette Cooper's frustrating Foreign Office move. The reshuffle that exposed Starmer's chaos. Right. Before we dive into this absolute mess of a reshuffle story, if you haven't already, do hit that subscribe button because Westminster never stops serving up drama, and neither do we here at UK Connors. Trust me, you'll want to stay in the loop for what's coming next. Now then, let's talk about what happens when political ambition meets bureaucratic reality, shall we? Because what we're about to unpack isn't just another Westminster reshuffle story. It's a masterclass in how even the most carefully laid political plans can unravel faster than a cheap suit in a thunderstorm. Picture this. You spent years, literally years, building relationships, crafting policies, and finally, you're getting somewhere with one of the most thankless jobs in government. The Home Office, migration policy, the stuff that makes or breaks political careers. You've got your plans in place, your international deals cooking, your deportation strategies mapped out. You're on the cusp of something that might actually work. And then, your own party leader pulls the rug from under you. That's exactly what happened to Yvette Cooper, and according to her husband Ed Balls, yes, that Ed Balls, she was not best pleased about it. In fact, he used the word frustrated, which in political spouse speak translates roughly to absolutely livid but too professional to say so publicly. But here's where it gets properly interesting. This wasn't just any reshuffle. This was Keir Starmer's big moment to show he could deliver the stability he'd been promising after years of Conservative chaos. Remember that? The man who was going to put an end to the revolving door of Westminster, who was going to bring competence back to government. Well, according to Balls, this reshuffle did precisely the opposite. It made Labour look just as chaotic as the Tories they'd spent years criticising. Now, let's be clear about what Cooper was giving up. The Home Office isn't glamorous, but it's where reputations are made and destroyed. She'd been working the migration brief like a chess grandmeister, building relationships with Germany, maintaining the France deal, turning around the asylum appeals system, getting other departments to actually share responsibility for housing. She was at that crucial point where all the pieces were falling into place, where she could finally start applying real pressure to solve the problems that have plagued successive governments. And then Starmer says, actually, Yvette, fancy a change of scenery? How about the Foreign Office? Now, don't get me wrong, Foreign Secretary is one of the great offices of state. It's prestigious, it's high profile, and frankly, most politicians would bite your hand off for it. But timing, as they say, is everything. And the timing here? Questionable at best. Ed Balls, never one to mince words, laid it out perfectly on his Political Currency podcast. He said Cooper was excited about the role. How could she not be? But also deeply frustrated at having to leave just when her Home Office work was gaining momentum. He described it as having to start from scratch at the Foreign Office while watching someone else take over all the progress she'd made on migration. But here's what makes this story absolutely fascinating. The optics. Starmer had built his entire political brand on being the antidote to chaos. Steady, reliable, competent, the grown-up in the room. Yet here he was, barely into his tenure, conducting the kind of early reshuffle that screams uncertainty and indecision. It's the political equivalent of rearranging the deck chairs on Titanic, and everyone could see it. The irony is delicious, isn't it? The man who spent years attacking conservative reshuffles for creating instability ends up doing exactly the same thing. And not just any reshuffle, one that moves arguably his most effective minister away from a brief where she was actually making headway. It's the sort of own goal that would make even the most seasoned political observers wince. Now, Cooper, being the professional she is, threw herself into her new role with characteristic determination. Her first trip? Kiev. Because nothing says, I'm serious about foreign policy, like visiting a war zone in your first week. It was a smart move, actually, immediate, visible, and guaranteed to generate the right headlines. £142 million in aid. Strong words about UK support for Ukraine. The full diplomatic treatment. Textbook Foreign Secretary behavior. But let's read between the lines here. This visit wasn't just about showing support for Ukraine, though that's obviously important. It was about establishing credibility. Fast. When you've been moved from a domestic brief to foreign affairs, you need to prove you belong on the international stage. And what better way to do that than standing in Kiev, delivering aid packages and stern warnings to Putin? The timing of her visit was particularly pointed, coming right after Russian drones had breached Polish airspace during strikes on Ukraine. It was Moscow's biggest aerial assault since the war began, targeting government buildings in Kiev for the first time. Cooper's response was swift and uncompromising: more aid, stronger support, and a clear message that UK backing for Ukraine remains unwavering and stronger than ever. But here's what's really interesting about all this, the subtext. Because while Cooper was in Kiev making grand statements about international security, back home, questions were being asked about why Starmer had disrupted a functioning Home Office operation for what appeared to be political convenience rather than administrative necessity. The new Home Secretary, Shabana Mahmood, suddenly found herself inheriting all of Cooper's carefully constructed migration plans. The Germany deal Cooper had been nurturing, now someone else's responsibility. The France agreement she'd been managing, passed in new hands. The asylum system reform she'd been implementing, starting over with a different minister who would have to learn the brief from scratch. It's worth noting that David Lammy, the outgoing foreign secretary who moved to justice, had spent 4 years building international relationships and contact around the world. So we had one minister with deep foreign policy experience being moved to domestic affairs, while another with extensive domestic policy experience was thrust into international relations. It's musical chairs, but with portfolios that affect millions of lives. The broader implications here are fascinating. This reshuffle sends a message, intended or not, about how Starmer views his own government's priorities. By moving Cooper away from migration, arguably one of the most politically sensitive and electorally important issues facing the government, he is either supremely confident that the problems are solved, or is admitting that they are too difficult to tackle head-on. Given that migration continues to dominate political discourse and public concern, the former seems unlikely. Which leaves us with the uncomfortable possibility that this reshuffle was about managing political optics rather than maximizing governmental effectiveness. And if that's the case, then Starmer has fallen into exactly the same trap that he criticized his predecessors for, prioritizing party management over good governance. The really frustrating thing, from a governance perspective, is that Cooper appeared to be making genuine progress. The migration system is notoriously complex, involving multiple departments, international agreements, and legal frameworks that take years to understand properly, let alone reform. She'd done the hard yards, built the relationships, and was finally at the point where her efforts might have started bearing fruit. Moving her now is like replacing a chef halfway through preparing a souffle, technically possible, but hardly optimal. What makes this even more intriguing is the personal dynamic at play. Ed Balls isn't just any political commentator. He's a former cabinet minister himself, someone who understands a game from the inside. His willingness to publicly criticize the reshuffle, even gently, suggests this isn't just about his wife's career disappointment. It's about a broader concern that Labour is repeating the mistakes they've spent years condemning. And let's be honest, the British public has had quite enough of governmental chaos. They've watched Conservative prime ministers come and go, reshuffles that seemed to happen weekly, and policy U-turns that made seasoned political observers dizzy. Starmer's entire pitch was that he'd be different, stable, reliable, a safe pair of hands. This reshuffle doesn't exactly reinforce that message. The international dimension adds another layer of complexity. Cooper's visit to Kiev, while symbolically important, also highlights the challenge of switching between domestic and international roles. Foreign policy requires different skills, different relationships, and different ways of thinking than domestic governance. She'll undoubtedly adapt. She's far too capable not to, but there's an inevitable learning curve that wouldn't have existed if she'd remained at the Home Office. Meanwhile, Shabana Mahmood faces the unenviable task of picking up where Cooper left off, but without the benefit of years of relationship building and policy development. It's not impossible, but it's certainly not efficient. And in politics, as in business, efficiency matters. Every month spent getting up to speed is a month when problems aren't being solved and progress isn't being made. What's particularly galling is that this reshuffle seems to have been driven by internal party dynamics rather than external necessity. There was no crisis that demanded immediate action, no scandal that required a fresh face, no policy failure that necessitated a change of direction. It appears to have been change for the sake of change, which is precisely the kind of purposeless activity that drives voters to distraction. The implications extend beyond just Cooper and Mahmood. Other ministers will be watching this carefully, wondering whether their own positions are secure, whether their long-term projects will be allowed to develop, or whether they too might find themselves moved just as their work begins to show results. It's hardly conducive to the kind of strategic, long-term thinking that effective government requires. There's also the question of what message this sends to civil servants and international partners. If ministers can be moved arbitrarily from briefs where they are making progress, how much confidence can permanent officials have in long-term policy directions? How much trust can foreign governments place in agreements negotiated by ministers who might not be there to see them through? These aren't abstract concerns. They have real-world consequences. Migration policy, in particular, requires sustained attention and consistent direction. It's not something you can dip in and out of without consequences. The fact that Cooper was apparently making progress makes a removal even more puzzling. What we're witnessing here is a masterclass in how political calculations can override administrative logic. Starmer presumably had his reason for the reshuffle, party management, media narrative, internal dynamics we're not privy to. But from the outside, it looks suspiciously like the kind of arbitrary decision-making that is spent years criticizing. The truly fascinating aspect is how this plays into broader narratives about Starmer's leadership style. Is he someone who sticks with what works, or someone who feels compelled to tinker and adjust? Is he confident enough in his ministers to let them see their projects through, or does he feel the need to move pieces around the board to maintain control? These are crucial questions that will define his tenure as Prime Minister. Cooper's professional response to the move has been exemplary, of course. She's thrown herself into the Foreign Secretary role with characteristic energy and competence. But the underlying questions remain. Was this move necessary? Was it wise? And what does it tell us about how Starmer intends to govern? The answer, frankly, isn't entirely reassuring. Because of experience, effective ministers can be moved away from areas where they're making progress simply to facilitate broader reshuffles. Then we're not seeing the stable, competent governance that was promised. We're seeing the same old Westminster game of musical chairs, just with different players. And that, perhaps more than any specific policy failure, is what should worry us most. Because voters didn't choose change just to get more of the same with different faces. They chose change to get better governance, more competent administration, and politicians who put effective delivery ahead of political convenience. Whether Starmer can still deliver on that promise remains to be seen, but this reshuffle certainly hasn't helped his cause. The coming months will be crucial in determining whether Cooper can replicate her Home Office success at the Foreign Office, whether Mahmood can maintain the momentum Cooper had built up on migration, and whether Starmer can avoid the appearance of being just another politician playing the Westminster game rather than focusing on the serious business of governing Britain effectively. What's certain is that this story is far from over, and the implications will be felt long after the headlines fade. Because in politics, as in life, timing is everything, and sometimes even the right move at the wrong time can look remarkably like the wrong move entirely. That's Westminster for you. Never a dull moment, always another twist around the corner. Make sure you're subscribed to UK Connors, because trust me, if this is how Starmer handles his early months in office, we're going to have plenty more stories like this to dissect. The game never stops, and neither do we.